You press your finger to the sensor, the screen unlocks, and somewhere in your mind, a quiet confidence settles. The feeling that your computer is protected, that your files are behind something stronger than a password, that the biometric lock Microsoft spent years marketing as the future of secure authentication is standing between everything on your machine and anyone who tries to get to it without your permission. That feeling is not completely wrong, but it is not completely right either. And the gap between where the confidence lives and where the actual security ends is a gap that security researchers, a black hat conference demonstration, and 3 separate CVEs with CVSS scores reaching as high as 9.8 have spent the past 2 years carefully documenting. Your fingerprint sensor is real. The authentication it provides is real. But the implementation, the specific way Windows Hello processes, stores, and validates biometric data on your machine, has been demonstrated to be bypassable, manipulable, and in specific configurations, fundamentally vulnerable to attacks that require no fingerprint, no face, and sometimes no physical sensor interaction at all. This is the story of exactly what those vulnerabilities are, which machines and configurations are affected, what the patches do and do not fix, and which specific settings you need to change right now to make sure you are getting the security that Windows Hello promised you, rather than the security theater that some configurations are actually providing. Let's go through every layer. Let's start at the hardware level, because the most fundamental and most surprising dimension of Windows Hello's security story involves not the software, but the physical fingerprint sensors themselves, the chips embedded in your laptop's touchpad or power button that do the actual biometric reading. In late 2023, Blackwing Intelligence security researchers Jesse Daguano and Timo Teres conducted a study sponsored by Microsoft's own offensive research and security engineering team. Microsoft commissioned the research to understand the security of its own fingerprint authentication ecosystem. What they found was not what the marketing implied. Security researchers bypassed Windows Hello Fingerprint authentication on Dell Inspiron, Lenovo ThinkPad, and Microsoft Surface Pro X laptops in attacks exploiting security flaws found in the embedded fingerprint sensors. Blackwing Intelligence security researchers discovered vulnerabilities during research sponsored by Microsoft's offensive research and security engineering team to assess the security of the top 3 embedded fingerprint sensors used for Windows Hello fingerprint authentication. Blackwing's Jesse Daguano and Timo Teres targeted embedded fingerprint sensors made by Elan, Synaptics, and Goodix on Microsoft Surface Pro X, Lenovo ThinkPad T14, and Dell Inspiron 15. 3 of the most widely deployed laptop brands, 3 different fingerprint sensor manufacturers, all bypassed, all on the same research engagement. The method of bypass differed between sensors, but the outcome was consistent. A researcher with physical access to the machine, using equipment and knowledge available to a sophisticated attacker, could authenticate to Windows Hello without using the registered user's fingerprint. On the Dell Inspiron with a Goodix sensor, and on the Lenovo ThinkPad with a Synaptics sensor, the bypass was particularly concerning because it exploited fundamental protocol weaknesses rather than implementation bugs that could be patched with a simple firmware update. Synaptics sensors, used by both Lenovo and Dell, had turned SDCP off by default and used a flawed custom transport layer security stack to secure USB communications. The Goodix sensors, also used by both Lenovo and Dell, could be bypassed because they are suitable for Windows and Linux, which does not support SDCP. The host driver sends an unauthenticated configuration packet to the sensor to specify what database to use during sensor initialization. SDCP, the Secure Device Connection Protocol, is Microsoft's own security protocol specifically designed to protect the communication channel between the Windows operating system and biometric sensors. It creates an authenticated, encrypted channel that prevents an attacker from intercepting or manipulating the data flowing between the sensor and Windows. When SDCP is properly implemented and enabled, it significantly raises the bar for sensor-level attacks. When SDCP is disabled, as it was by default on the Synaptics sensors used in Dell and Lenovo devices, that protective channel does not exist, and the communication between the sensor and Windows is vulnerable to interception and manipulation. The Goodix sensor bypass was structurally different and arguably more concerning. Because Goodix sensors support both Windows and Linux does not implement SDCP, the sensor's initialization sequence includes an unauthenticated configuration packet that specifies which fingerprint database to use. An attacker who could intercept and modify this initialization packet, sending their own fingerprint database rather than the legitimate one, could cause the sensor to authenticate against a database containing the attacker's own fingerprint, rather than the registered user's fingerprint. The Windows operating system would receive a successful authentication signal from the sensor, with no way to know that the database being used was not the one registered by the legitimate user. These are not theoretical attacks demonstrated only in highly controlled laboratory conditions. They are attacks demonstrated on commercially available consumer laptops by researchers using equipment and techniques that are within reach of sophisticated threat actors. The Blackwing research was presented publicly and the techniques documented in sufficient detail that motivated attackers with appropriate resources could replicate them. The attack requires physical access to the machine. These are not remote attacks, but physical access is exactly the attack scenario that Windows Hello's local authentication is supposed to protect against. If someone needs physical access to your laptop to bypass your fingerprint, and the fingerprint can be bypassed with physical access, the security model has a problem. Now let's move from the hardware sensor level to the software level, because alongside the hardware research, a sequence of software vulnerabilities in Windows Hello's authentication infrastructure has been documented and patched, or in some cases partially patched, over the past 2 years. These CVEs represent different layers of the authentication stack and collectively paint a picture of a security feature that was deployed at consumer scale before all of its attack surfaces had been fully hardened. CVE 2026-20804 is a Windows Hello tampering vulnerability first flagged by security researchers in August 2025 and demonstrated at Black Hat 2025. The vulnerability allows a local administrator to inject biometric information that would let a computer recognize any face or fingerprint, effectively bypassing Windows Hello authentication. German researchers demonstrated at Black Hat 2025 how attackers could inject biometric data to bypass Windows Hello authentication without detection. The Black Hat 2025 demonstration is the most publicly visible and most dramatically documented of the Windows Hello vulnerabilities, specifically because Black Hat is one of the premier cybersecurity conferences in the world, and the demonstrations presented there reach an audience of tens of thousands of security professionals and are subsequently covered extensively in the security press. German researchers demonstrated on stage at Black Hat that a local administrator could inject synthetic biometric data into Windows Hello's template storage, effectively registering an attacker's own biometric data as if it belonged to the legitimate user, and that Windows Hello would subsequently authenticate the attacker as the legitimate user. The injection worked without detection and without triggering any security alert. Windows Hello saw a successful fingerprint match and unlocked. The fingerprint did not belong to the person who set up the device. Microsoft documented the autofill restriction in the January 2026 Patch Tuesday release notes for updates KB 507.4109 and KB 507.3455. The 6-month gap between discovery and full mitigation highlights the complexity of patching authentication infrastructure without disrupting workflows. Microsoft's staged approach documenting the restriction in January, enforcing in February, gave organizations minimal preparation time. 6 months between public discovery at a major security conference and a complete mitigation being deployed through Windows Update. During those 6 months, the vulnerability was publicly known, described in sufficient detail for reproduction, and present on every Windows machine with Windows Hello enabled. The 6-month timeline reflects the genuine engineering complexity of modifying core authentication infrastructure while maintaining compatibility with the enormous diversity of hardware and software configurations that depend on Windows Hello. But it also represents 6 months of documented, publicly known vulnerability exposure for hundreds of millions of Windows machines. CVE 2026-27906 is a critical severity. Windows Hello vulnerability with a CVSS score of 9.8. Its EPSS score puts the probability of exploitation in the next 30 days at 64%. Windows Hello handles biometric and PIN sign-in, and the security feature bypass targets the Windows 10 21H2 family across x64, ARM64, and 32-bit at CVSS 9.8. A CVSS score of 9.8 on a Windows Hello bypass vulnerability is one of the highest severity ratings possible for a local authentication security feature bypass. CVSS 9.8 indicates that the vulnerability is highly exploitable, that successful exploitation has severe impact, and that exploitation complexity is low meaning. It does not require unusual conditions or exceptional attacker skill to exploit. The EPSS score puts the probability of exploitation in the next 30 days at 64%. The Exploit Prediction Scoring System EPSS is a data-driven model that estimates the probability that a specific vulnerability will be exploited in the wild within 30 days, based on vulnerability characteristics and observed exploitation patterns for comparable flaws. A 64% EPSS score is extraordinarily high and reflects both the severity and the exploitability of this vulnerability in the real-world threat landscape. Consumers usually experience Windows Hello as a convenience feature, not a security architecture. A bypass can therefore be easy to shrug off until it is framed correctly. If an attacker can exploit a weakness in the local trust layer, then the promise that face, fingerprint, or PIN is safer than a password becomes harder to defend without caveats. Hello is a user experience feature and a security boundary. Enterprise deployments depend on it for policy enforcement. Consumer trust is built on the assumption that local sign-in is robust. This observation from the Windows Forum CVE analysis captures the specific consumer trust problem at the heart of the Windows Hello vulnerability story. The feature is marketed with the explicit message that biometric authentication is more secure than a password. Millions of users have configured Windows Hello specifically because they believed that message and wanted stronger security than a typed password provides. When the biometric authentication can be bypassed, whether through hardware sensor manipulation, through software-level biometric template injection, or through authentication protocol weaknesses, the security that users believe they have is not the security they actually have. That gap between perceived security and actual security is arguably more dangerous than having no security feature at all, because users who know they have a weak lock take different precautions than users who believe they have a strong one. CVE 2025-26635 exposes a critical weakness in Windows Hello's network authentication. The flaw allows an attacker who already has some level of access or is authorized to bypass certain security features by exploiting weak authentication in the Windows Hello for Business. Network login out-of-the-box configuration. It applies to Windows 10 and 11 with Windows Hello for Business enabled. Windows Hello for Business. The enterprise deployment of Windows Hello that integrates with Active Directory and corporate identity infrastructure has its own distinct attack surface compared to consumer. Windows Hello and CVE 2025-26635 illustrates a specific weakness in the network authentication component. An attacker with any level of existing access to a corporate network where Windows Hello for Business is deployed can exploit this flaw to bypass the security controls that are supposed to govern authentication. In an enterprise context where Windows Hello for Business is a core component of the identity and access management architecture, a bypass of its network authentication represents a potential path to unauthorized access to corporate resources at scale. These overwritten templates can be used to impersonate legitimate users across enterprise identity systems. This vulnerability builds on earlier concerns raised by CVE 2025-26644, a spoofing flaw disclosed in April, that also targeted weaknesses in biometric template storage. The pattern of CVE 2025-26644, followed by CVE 2026-2804, both targeting biometric template storage through different mechanisms, reveals a recurring attack surface in how Windows Hello stores and protects the biometric data that it uses as the basis for authentication. Template storage is the most fundamental security-sensitive component of any biometric system. If the stored template can be modified, replaced, or injected without appropriate authorization and integrity verification, then the entire authentication chain built on top of that template is compromised, regardless of how sophisticated the matching algorithm or the sensor hardware is. Two separate vulnerabilities targeting template storage in consecutive years suggests that this attack surface has not been fully hardened and warrants continued attention. Now let's talk about the specific settings and configurations that make the difference between vulnerable and protected, because not all Windows Hello configurations carry the same risk profile, and the changes available to you can meaningfully improve your security posture even before or alongside patching. The most important setting change is enabling enhanced sign-in security, also known as ESS, if your hardware supports it. Enhanced sign-in security is a Windows Hello configuration that requires the biometric processing to occur within a secure or isolated hardware environment rather than in the general operating system environment. The recommendation of the researchers to the manufacturers is clear. SDCP is a powerful protocol, but it does not help if it is not enabled or when it can be bypassed by using other weak links in your setup. ESS goes further than SDCP. It not only secures the communication channel between the sensor and Windows, but requires that the entire biometric matching process occur within a trusted execution environment that is isolated from the main operating system and inaccessible to software running at the administrator level. This isolation is what prevents the biometric template injection attack demonstrated at Black Hat 2025, because an attacker operating at the administrator level cannot reach the trusted execution environment where ESS stores and processes biometric data. To check whether ESS is enabled on your machine, navigate to Settings, then Accounts, then Sign-in Options, then Windows Hello Fingerprint or Windows Hello Face, depending on which biometric you use. If enhanced sign-in security is available on your hardware, you will see it referenced in this section. If your hardware supports ESS and it is not enabled, enabling it is the most significant single security improvement available for Windows Hello on your machine. Not all hardware supports ESS. It requires specific TPM 2.0 integration and sensor hardware that is certified for the enhanced mode. But for hardware that does support it, ESS provides meaningful protection against the template injection attack class. The second critical action is ensuring that your Windows updates are current, specifically verifying that KB 5074109 and KB 5074455 from the January 2026 Patch Tuesday are installed, and that subsequent cumulative updates through July 2026 are present. The mitigation for CVE 2026-2804, the Black Hat 2025 biometric injection vulnerability, was staged across January and February 2026 updates. The patch for CVE 2026-27906, the CVSS 9.8 bypass, was released in April 2026. The patch for CVE 2025-26635, the network authentication bypass, was released in April 2025. A machine that has not received all updates through April 2026 may be missing patches for multiple distinct Windows Hello vulnerabilities simultaneously. Open Settings, then Windows Update, then Update History, and verify that cumulative updates for January, February, April, and July 2026 all appear as successfully installed. If any are missing, run a Windows Update check immediately and install all pending updates. For the Windows Hello vulnerability specifically, patching is more urgently important than for many other vulnerability categories because the attack scenario, someone with physical access to your laptop attempting to bypass the lock screen, is precisely the scenario where you most need your security to function correctly, and precisely the scenario Windows Hello is marketed as protecting against. The third action is reviewing and tightening the Windows Hello PIN as a fallback authentication method, because the relationship between your biometric authentication and your PIN is one of the less well understood aspects of Windows Hello security. Windows Hello always configures a PIN alongside the biometric method because biometric sensors can fail a cut finger, a camera obscured by glare, a sensor that cannot read properly, and the PIN provides a fallback. The security implication of this fallback is significant. The PIN is always an authentication path, meaning that the overall security of Windows Hello is determined by the weaker of the biometric method and the PIN. If your PIN is simple 4 digits, your birth year, a repeating pattern, then the security of your Windows Hello Fingerprint or face recognition is capped by the security of that PIN, because an attacker who cannot bypass the biometric can instead attempt the PIN. Navigate to Settings, then Accounts, then Sign-in Options, then Windows Hello PIN. If your PIN is fewer than 6 digits or follows an obvious pattern, change it to a longer, less predictable value. Windows Hello supports pins with letters and special characters. A Windows Hello pin is not limited to numbers despite the name, and a complex pin functions similarly to a password in terms of brute force resistance. Enabling the Windows Hello pin complexity requirements through the settings interface or through group policy on Windows 11 Pro prevents simple pins from being set and ensures the fallback authentication method provides meaningful protection. The fourth action specifically addresses the hardware sensor security findings from the Blackwing research. The SDCP protocol that protects the communication channel between fingerprint sensors and Windows was disabled by default on Synaptics sensors used in Dell and Lenovo devices. Enabling SDCP where possible requires interaction with the sensor's driver settings rather than the Windows Settings app. It is a configuration in the sensor driver itself. Check your device manufacturer's support site for firmware and driver updates for your specific fingerprint sensor, as manufacturers released updates in response to the Blackwing research that addressed SDCP configuration issues. Ensuring your fingerprint sensor firmware and associated drivers are at their most current versions is the appropriate remediation for the hardware-level vulnerabilities identified in the 2023 Blackwing research. The fifth action is enabling Windows Defender Credential Guard if you are on Windows 11 Pro or Enterprise, because Credential Guard provides virtualization-based security that protects authentication credentials from being accessed by processes running at administrator level. While Credential Guard is primarily associated with protecting domain credentials in enterprise environments, its underlying virtualization-based isolation technology is related to the isolation that makes enhanced sign-in security effective for Windows Hello. Enabling Credential Guard through Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Device Security, then Core Isolation adds a layer of isolation to your authentication infrastructure that makes it more resistant to the class of attacks where a process running at high privilege levels attempts to manipulate or extract authentication data. The sixth action involves reviewing Windows Hello for business configuration, specifically if you're using a machine that is joined to a corporate domain or enrolled in Microsoft Intune device management. CVE 2025-2635 specifically targets the network authentication component of Windows Hello for Business. Your organization's IT department should have applied the April 2025 patch that addresses this vulnerability. but verifying that your managed device's update compliance status confirms the patch is installed is worth checking with your IT team, particularly if your organization relies heavily on Windows Hello for Business as part of its zero trust or passwordless authentication strategy. The seventh action is one that many security professionals recommend as a general principle that the Windows Hello vulnerability history specifically reinforces: do not rely on any single authentication mechanism as your only line of defense. Windows Hello, even when patched and properly configured, is one layer of security, not a complete security architecture. Complementing Windows Hello with full disk encryption through BitLocker so that an attacker who bypasses the login screen still cannot access the data on the encrypted drive without the encryption key adds a layer of protection that is independent of the Windows Hello authentication mechanism, and that significantly raises the bar for attacks that require physical access to the machine. Verifying that BitLocker is enabled on your system, drive-through settings, then privacy and security, then device encryption ensures that the data on your machine is protected even if the authentication layer is somehow bypassed. The eighth action is specifically relevant to users who have Surface Pro X, Lenovo ThinkPad T14, or Dell Inspiron 15 devices, because these are the specific machines identified in the Blackwing research as having fingerprint sensors with SDCP disabled by default and hardware-level bypass vulnerabilities. Users of these specific devices should check for the most recent fingerprint sensor firmware updates from their manufacturer's support site, verify that SDCP has been enabled in updated firmware, and consider whether Windows Hello ESS is supported and enabled on their specific hardware configuration. Microsoft's guidance for affected hardware was issued alongside the Blackwing research publication, and the firmware updates from Elon, Synaptics, and Goodix that address the specific sensor vulnerabilities are the appropriate hardware-level remediation for those devices. Let's step back and address the question this entire story raises most directly. Should you still use Windows Hello fingerprint authentication, or has the accumulation of these vulnerabilities made it more of a liability than an asset? The honest answer requires distinguishing between the specific attack scenarios the vulnerabilities enable and the realistic threat model for most users. The hardware sensor, bypass attacks, and the software biometric injection attacks demonstrated at Black Hat all require physical access to the machine. An attacker who cannot physically touch your laptop cannot exploit these vulnerabilities remotely. For the vast majority of users, the most likely threat scenario for their laptop is opportunistic theft. Someone takes the machine and wants access to what is on it. Against an opportunistic thief who does not have the specialized knowledge, equipment, or motivation to perform a sensor bypass or template injection attack, Windows Hello fingerprint authentication with a patched and updated system remains meaningfully more secure than a simple password, and dramatically more secure than no authentication at all. The concern is more acute for users who face targeted physical access threats, corporate espionage scenarios, high-value targets for nation-state actors, or situations where the attacker has both the motivation to access your specific machine and the resources to perform a sophisticated attack. For these users, the vulnerabilities documented in the Windows Hello research represent a genuine gap between the security they need and the security the biometric lock provides, and the additional measures. Enhanced sign-in security, BitLocker, Credential Guard, and frequent patching become not optional enhancements, but necessary components of an adequate security posture. A bypass can erode confidence in passwordless strategies. The impact can extend beyond the affected machine. Microsoft's vulnerability pages are designed to answer a deceptively simple question: how much should a customer trust the technical assessment? The right answer to that question, based on the documented vulnerability history, is trust Windows Hello as one layer of a defense-in-depth security posture, not as the sole security boundary between your data and an attacker with physical access to your machine. Enable ESS where supported, keep updates current, use BitLocker. Set a strong PIN as the fallback. And understand that the fingerprint that unlocks your screen in a second is a convenience feature that is more secure than nothing, and less secure than a properly implemented, fully patched multi-layer authentication architecture. The sensors are real, the vulnerabilities are documented, the patches exist and they work. And the settings, ESS, BitLocker, Credential Guard, a strong PIN, current firmware, are the difference between Windows Hello as a well-implemented component of a layered security posture and Windows Hello as a single point of failure in a system whose security was accepted on faith rather than verified in practice. Your finger unlocks your machine. Make sure it is the only thing that can.